It took 121 seconds. A more than 30-year-long, almost spotless safety record was erased within minutes as the Aerospatiale/BAC Concorde crashed into a hotel just west of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. But what exactly happened? And in the time leading up to the flight, using the final report, I will now tell you the story of the beginning of the end of the Concorde. Stay tuned. Air France Flight 4590 was actually a shorter flight. It was scheduled to fly from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France to JFK International in New York, United States. Once they landed in New York, the passengers, mainly German but of other nationalities as well, were supposed to board a cruise ship headed for Ecuador in South America, making this probably a once-in-a-lifetime trip. There were 100 passengers scheduled for the flight, 6 cabin crew, and 3 pilots. The aircraft being flown was a legendary Aerospatiale/BAC Concorde, one of the most beautiful aircraft ever constructed and a true feat of engineering. The Concorde first flew on March 2, 1969, and during its more than 30-year career, it had never suffered a fatal accident. A few technical aspects of the Concorde are essential to understand before we continue. The aircraft's famous delta wing was chosen because it performs well at subsonic, transonic, and supersonic speeds. The drawback of a delta wing, however, is that it requires both a high speed and a high angle of attack to generate enough lift during takeoff and landing. For context, a Boeing 737 typically takes off at 140 to 150 knots. The Concorde needed about 200 knots. This higher takeoff speed placed enormous stress on its tires. Over its operational history, the Concorde experienced 57 tire bursts. In 12 of those incidents, the debris caused structural damage, and in 6, the wing fuel tanks were penetrated. The most serious of these happened in 1979 when a Concorde taking off from Washington suffered a tire burst. Debris punctured a wing tank and damaged the hydraulic system, preventing the landing gear from retracting. After that, a significant investigation led to recommendations to strengthen the tires and improve protection for hydraulic systems near the landing gear. Investigators also evaluated the risk of fire, but concluded that any leaked fuel from such incidents would likely be small and thus carried a low fire risk. The Concorde also had a complex fuel system, consisting of 13 tanks, 12 housed in the wings and fuselage, and a 13th trim tank at the rear of the aircraft. This rear tank was used to manage the aircraft's center of gravity, particularly critical during takeoff. The Concorde's engines were 4 Rolls-Royce/Snecma Olympus turbojets, each equipped with afterburners for extra thrust. These engines had primary and secondary air intakes, the latter which would later prove significant in this story. Flight 4590 was scheduled to depart on July 25, 2000. From the beginning, issues were present. Originally, another Concorde was scheduled, but it was replaced during the night. The replacement aircraft had a known issue with one of its thrust reversers, which, while not grounding the aircraft, did come with a performance penalty that could require a refueling stop en route. There were also passenger and baggage discrepancies. Many of the mostly German passengers had flown in earlier, but issues with Air France's system led to them, and their luggage being omitted from the initial manifest. Ultimately, the aircraft departed with 19 more bags than listed, adding weight. Around 1,400 hours Universal Time Coordinated, 1,600 hours local Paris time, the flight crew began their pre-flight checks. The crew included a 54-year-old captain with over 13,000 hours, 317 on Concorde, a 50-year-old first officer with over 10,000 hours, 2,698 on Concorde, and a 58-year-old flight engineer with over 12,000 hours, 937 on Concorde. This was a highly experienced crew, part of Air France's elite Concorde group of around 30 pilots. During pre-flight, the flight engineer informed the captain that the thrust reverser had been fixed so they could load enough fuel for a direct flight to New York. They decided on 95 tons of fuel, bringing the aircraft close to its maximum structural takeoff weight. Performance speeds were set: V1 at 150 knots, VR at 198 knots, and V2 at 220 knots. A 2-ton taxi fuel burn was expected, but this estimate would later prove inaccurate. By 1425, the aircraft was ready. Engines were started in sequence. 3, 2, 4, and 1, and they received taxi clearance. The Concorde was assigned runway 26 right, one of Charles de Gaulle's longest. Given the aircraft high weight, the captain requested a full-length departure rather than an intersection takeoff. As the crew taxied, the first officer noted an electrical system for the rudder was intermittently switching from its primary to backup mode. The flight engineer acknowledged it, noting it was a dispatchable fault and could be ignored unless it became persistent. For minutes before departure, the crew also initiated a fuel transfer from the rear trim tank to optimize the center of gravity for takeoff. This transfer was completed successfully. Around this time, a Continental Airlines DC-10 took off from the same runway. During its takeoff roll, a 43-centimeter metal strip fell from its right engine. There were no cockpit alerts and no immediate inspections, as France only required 2 runway checks per day. The strip remained on the runway. As the Concorde neared the holding point, the captain gave a detailed takeoff briefing. At 180 tons takeoff weight, full afterburners would be used. He explained that between 0 and 100 knots, they would abort for any warning. Between 100 knots and V1, they'd only abort for engine fire, a tire flash, or a failure call-out. After V1, they were committed to takeoff and would return to land if necessary. The captain asked the flight engineer how much fuel had been used during taxi. The engineer replied, 800 kilos, meaning they had burned about a ton less than expected. Since their takeoff calculations had assumed a 2-ton taxi burn, this meant they were now 800 kilos over their maximum takeoff weight. The flight engineer also reported brake temperatures of 150 degrees Celsius, roughly equal on both sides, a detail that would later matter greatly. At 14:42 Universal Time Coordinated, the Concorde was cleared to line up and take off. The surface wind was 0-90 degrees at 8 knots, a tailwind the crew had not included in their calculations. Had they done so, they would have seen the max allowable takeoff weight reduced to 180 tons. The limiting factor in such cases is the aircraft's tire speed, which increases with tailwind. However, investigators later concluded that this didn't directly contribute to the accident. At 14 hours 42 minutes and 30 seconds, the captain advanced all 4 thrust levers. The Olympus engines roared with full afterburner, and the aircraft accelerated. 24 seconds later, the first officer called out 100, and the flight engineer confirmed all 4 engines and reheats were functioning. 6 seconds after that, V1 was called. Now there was no turning back. At 14 hours 43 minutes and 9 seconds, a slight yaw to the left was recorded by the flight data recorder without rudder input. Around the 1,700-meter mark on the runway, investigators later found debris from the Concorde's left landing gear, likely indicating the moment the aircraft rolled over the DC-10's metal strip.